Bye weeks, injuries, and tough matchups. I'm looking at the players you should avoid in week 5. What is up, Fantasy Bankroll fam? Once again, I'm your host, Robert Banker, and week 5 is here. And like I mentioned in the tease, bye weeks and injuries are shaking up lineups. So let's take a look at some of the players I think you should avoid this week. It's my Bearish Report. Let's go. All right, the first player on my Bearish list for week 5, Miami Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. Now, I just lost Tyreek Hill last week with that gruesome knee injury, and he's facing a Panthers team that, despite its record, has been very stingy against the pass all year, and it ranks top 5 in regards to fantasy points given up to the quarterback position. All right, the next player on my bearish list for week 5, Jacksonville Jaguars quarterback Trevor Lawrence. Now, Lawrence has faced the 49ers, the Texans, and the Panthers in 3 of the first 4 games of the season. And all 3 of those teams rank in the top 5 in regards to fewest fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. And his reward for that gauntlet is to face a Kansas City Chiefs defense that ranks 8th in that same metric. The tough stretch is going to end for Lawrence sometime. I just don't think it's this week. The next player on my bearish list for week 5, Las Vegas Raiders running back Ashton Jeanty. Let's be honest, it hasn't been the start to his rookie season as some had hoped. But he did have that monster breakout game in week 4, scoring 3 total touchdowns. And his reward this week is to face a Colts defense that ranks 7th in total rushing yards allowed and 8th in fantasy points allowed to the running back position. The next player on my bearish list for week 5, Minnesota Vikings running back Jordan Mason. Now, the Browns haven't been a good team at all this season, but they have been extremely stout against the run, giving up the fewest rushing yards in the league and ranking 3rd in fantasy points allowed to the running back position, which I think is even more impressive considering they've been completely out of a couple games in the second half, and that's when teams like to run the ball more to grind out the clock. Either way, I think Mason has a tough go this week. All right, the next player on my bearish list for week 5, Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver A.J. Brown. Now, he made some noise on social media this week with some posts that may or may not have been about his role in the offense, and he had a meeting with head coach Nick Sirianni to get things cleared up. But if he wants to get going this week, he's going to have to do it against the Broncos D that features reigning Defensive Player of the Year Patrick Surtain, is giving up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers on the year, and has only allowed 2 passing touchdowns on the season. So this might not be the get-right week that Brown and fantasy owners are looking for. The next player on my bearish list for week 5, Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver Emeka Egbuka. Now, as a Buckeyes fan, I love what the rookie's been doing so far this season, catching 18 passes for 282 yards and 4 touchdowns through the first 4 weeks. But this week he goes against the Seattle Seahawks defense that ranks 2nd in fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position so far this season. And with Chris Godwin still getting back into game shape and Mike Evans and Bucky Irvin missing this week, it's only going to make it that much easier for the Seahawks to key on Egbuka, and I think it'll be a tough week for the rookie. All right, the first tight end I'm avoiding this week, Jacksonville Jaguars tight end Brenton Strange. Now, Strange has caught 6 to 7 targets the past 2 weeks, but in week 5 he goes against a Chiefs defense that's allowed only 3-point fantasy points per week to tight ends, which is good enough for 3rd in the league. And they're the only team to not allow a single point in the red zone to a tight end this season. All right, the last player on my week 5 bearish list, Baltimore Ravens tight end Mark Andrews. Now, Andrews finally had his breakout in week 3, scoring 2 touchdowns, but he was just okay again in week 4. While he caught 7 passes, it was only for 30 yards and no touchdowns. And this week he'll be going against the Texans defense that's given up the 5th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position on the season. And he'll be doing so without his MVP quarterback, as Lamar Jackson's going to miss this game with a hamstring injury. All right, everybody, week 5 bearish report is in the books. If you haven't yet, please go check out my bullish report on the players I like for this week. I'll post a link up here. Please subscribe and spike that like button and leave me a comment letting me know what fantasy topics you want me to cover next. And don't forget, bye weeks and London kickoff, so get those lineups set early. Let's go.